A reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. And God spoke all these words: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. The word of the Lord.
So if you've been with us, we've been looking at the book of Exodus, and last week we started to look at each of the 10 commandments, the law that God gives to the Israelites after he frees them out of being under the hand of Pharaoh, out of slavery as slaves, frees them for a new life, and he gives them this law, and we talked about how this is really the law of love that God gives. God says, I've saved you, and now here's how you are to relate to me in reciprocal love. And this is how you love your neighbor, love the people around you. And following these laws is going to free you to give you the kind of life that you're truly meant for. Or living in this kind of a way in line with God's law is meant to free us to be truly human. That's what we've been looking at. Like, this is the life that we were meant for that God is offering, which means the giving of the law is essentially, it's a real gift to us. We sort of think of rules and the commandments of God as being this joy-killing, restrictive thing that we don't want to follow. In actuality, it's meant to be a gift, right, that helps guide us and directs us, especially in our lives today where we're really clueless as to what kind of life will help me to most flourish. Because we said last week that a lot of us are not flourishing and we're looking for direction and needing direction. This is what the law of God is meant to give to us. And today, we're moving on to the second commandment, which is really a follow-on of the first commandment, where last week we talked about how you're to have no other gods before him. There's no false gods to be in your life, that he is supposed to be your supreme love. And now today in the second commandment, he's going to teach us that it's not just about having him as a God. It's about actually having a true worship of the true God. So in other words, the second commandment is all about helping us to not have a false worship of the true God, or loving him the way that he calls us to love, by not creating an image of God in our own minds, but actually being shaped by him, how he forms or how he reveals himself to be. You know, every time when I think about the second commandment, this is a risky way to start a sermon by quoting Will Ferrell, but every time I actually imagine Will Ferrell has this spoof in one of his movies, Talladega Nights, right, where he sort of is making fun of this idea. And he's praying before the meal to bless the meal, and he starts praying to little baby Jesus. Because he says, the Christmas Jesus is my favorite one. I like the small, cuddly, warm sort of Jesus. You know, he starts praying to little baby Jesus, and then his partner, John C. Reilly, he jumps in and he says, well, I like to imagine Jesus with a tuxedo shirt on because says he's formal, but he also likes to have fun, just like me. I like to have a little bit of fun. So that's the kind of Jesus that I like to imagine. And of course, it's a hilarious scene. I won't endorse the movie or not. You can make your own judgments on that. And it's a funny scene, right? But in reality, that kind of an idea is something that we all do. We are constantly shaping God in our own image and worshiping him the way that we want. And in this second command, Jesus and God is actually teaching us that how we worship matters nearly as much as whom we worship. Because how we worship is going to also shape us. It'll either free us or it'll enslave us. It'll either drive us closer to God or further from him. So how we worship is as important as whom we worship. And the question that we're going to be asking is, are you worshiping God as he has revealed himself to be, or are we worshiping an image of God that we have created ourselves? So let's look at that today by looking at the second commandment, which might be a little esoteric for you. And so let's actually start with the reason for the command. And then we'll look at, secondly, why we tend to resist this command. And then finally, we'll see how we can be renewed by this command. All right, so let's look at the reason for it, why we resist it, and how we can be renewed by it. So first, look with me, starting on verse 4. Take a look at this commandment specifically. He says, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or in the earth below, beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." Now, this is probably one of those commandments that if you're familiar with the Ten Commandments and you heard this, you probably think, I've never violated this commandment, right? We're not pulling out wooden images of God and bowing down to it, right? So you might think, I don't even know what this is. This doesn't even make sense. What is it that we might do? What's the reason for this particular command? And I want us to kind of think back to the story and the narrative of the Israelites. We talked about how they were just freed from under the Egyptians, which means they had been spending 400 plus years living with the Egyptians. And of course, the Egyptians had plenty of gods, and all of them were in the form of something in created nature. The sun god, the moon god, the star god, right? So the Egyptians had the god Horus, which had sort of the head of a falcon. And so all of the Egyptian gods were fashioned after some kind of an animal or something within creation. And so when God is giving this particular command to the Israelites after he frees them, this is him clearly saying, I want you to break away from your former lives. You are no longer to act like or live as if you are back in Egypt under these other kinds of false gods. That's what he's sort of saying. And he's saying, I am Yahweh. I am utterly different from all of these other false gods. That, again, is what the first commandment is all about. But then in this second commandment, he's basically saying that the reason why you cannot worship the true God in a false way, however you want, because just imagine how much these former slaves would have been tempted to imagine this God who freed them in the form of what they knew from before. They would have been tempted to just import a lot of ideas about Yahweh based on their experience with former false gods. And that is what God is saying. You can't do that. You cannot worship me the way that you want to just worship me. You have to, he's teaching them, to worship me and follow me based on how I have revealed myself to you. You don't get to do that to me. That is why Israel is not allowed to make any kind of a physical representation or an image and then bow down to that image as if it was the God Yahweh. Because he's saying, that's not me. That's not how I want to be worshipped. And here's essentially why that is the case. Because the moment that we start to worship based off of some kind of an image of God, we are immediately bottling God up. Here's what I mean by that. The moment that you make an image and you imagine something of the invisible spirit God into an image, you are inevitably picking and choosing some element or some characteristic of God over another. Right? So at the risk of saying, imagine God with me, how would you even go about that? Right? What does he look like? How would you even represent him? Is he strong like an ox? Is he majestic like a bird? But what about his holiness or his righteousness? What about all these other elements of God that can't be captured in one particular form? And so the problem with images is ultimately that no matter what, they can't help but conceal more about God than it can reveal things about him. Images will always conceal more than it can reveal about what God is and what God is like. And you can't worship images without immediately drastically changing God's very nature and his character and his truth about what he says about himself, which is why there is nothing in created nature that could possibly be adequate, right, to capture what God actually is, the infinite God. It can never capture it in an adequate way. Again, let alone coming from the mind of slaves who didn't have a deep relationship with this God who saved them yet. Here's a quote from one commentator about this. It says this: God is infinite and invisible. He is omnipotent, which means all-powerful, and omnipresent, which is he's everywhere. He's a living spirit. Therefore, to carve him into a piece of wood or stone is to deny his attributes, the essential characteristics of his divine being. An idol makes the infinite God finite, the invisible God visible, the omnipotent God impotent, the all-present God local, the living God dead, and the spiritual God material. In short, It makes him the exact opposite of what he is actually like. Thus, the whole idea of idolatry rests on the absurdity of human beings trying to make their own image of God. You see that? So what is God after in the second commandment? It is objective truth about who he is and therefore how we are to approach him in our worship. That's what he is after. And you might still think, well, I don't have any physical images of him, Pastor David. Like, what do you mean by that? But another way to understand the second commandment is not just to make any graven images of him, but it comes from the same word. The second commandment essentially is saying, you shall not imagine me however you want. Whether it's a physical representation or a mental representation of who God is. Because we will inevitably obscure and reshape the truth based on what we want God to be and not the other way around. And the reason why I say that is because our culture today is seeped in this idea that you can sort of define your reality however you want, and that includes defining the reality about who God is. There's a great book called Strange Rites that's written by Isabella Tara Burton, or Tara Isabella Burton. She talks about how people today have a bespoke kind of religion now, right? And she calls these people the remixed spirituals, right? Where you can basically pick and choose elements of whatever you like and curate and create your own God in a sense. It's a build your own God kind of an idea. Here's a quote from her book, Strange Rites. She says this. She's talking about the remixed religious people. They value intuition, personal feeling, and experiences. They demand to rewrite their own scripts about how the universe and human beings operate, shaped by the twin forces of a creative, communicative internet and a consumer capitalism. Today's remixed don't want to receive doctrine to assent automatically to a creed. They want to choose. And more often than not, they want to purchase the spiritual path that feels more authentic, more meaningful to them. A build your own kind of a God, take objective truth and make it whatever you want kind of a life. And this is rampant in our culture, and it absolutely seeps into the life of the church, whether you consider yourself a Christian or not. See, these kinds of cultural values, the narratives that we swim in, are always pushing us more and more to be our own arbiter of truth, even if that means truth about God and what he has said he is like. You know, it's this whole, hey, you live your truth and I'll live mine. Well, that works when it's just related to just your own personal experience, but when it starts to get to the character and the nature of God, that doesn't really work. It's not meant to work. And again, this comes into the life of the church as well. All right, we break this command, this second commandment, we break it every time or any time we take particular parts of the Bible or characteristics about God that we like, and we throw out the elements that we don't. Or we downplay the elements that make us feel uncomfortable so that we can curate a God that we resonate with, that we can relate to, that feels more digestible to us, that makes more sense to us. Until we're left with a God that we are so pleased with. That's what we can do all the time in our mental images of him. Right? How many of us have thought, I couldn't possibly believe in a God nor worship a God that says he's wrathful, or a God who allows suffering to remain in this world. I can't possibly believe in a God like that. Or, probably more relevant to us today, is I want to worship a God who perfectly aligns with my particular political affiliation, that never challenges those things in my political party. But this is the God of this party. It's a God who says, I care about life only in the womb, but not on the streets. Or it's a God who says, I care about racial justice, but I don't care about what you do with your body and sexuality and marriage. See, in all of those ways, we're creating and curating a kind of God that we want. And God is saying, don't do that. Don't imagine me however you want me to be. I'm God. I get to define who I am. You don't get to do that. And it means this, essentially, that if your image of God, who God is to you, if he never challenges anything about your sensibilities, if this God is never offensive to you, you can be guaranteed that this is a God made in your image and not the true God. You're not worshiping how he's revealed himself to be in Scripture. You can guarantee that. And of course, this is true in any relationship, right? Like you and I don't have the authority or the ability to import what we want other people to be. We would never do that in another relationship. How dare we possibly do that in our relationship with the living God? He says that must especially be true of me. You don't get to decide these things. I'm God. You don't get to worship me however you want. So my question this morning for us is, what is God like to you? And where are you getting these images of who God is? Is it from TV and movies? Is it from your parents and how you grew up? Is it from who you follow on Instagram or different political figures that you listen to? Or is it based off of how he has revealed himself in his word, through Scripture in the Bible? That is true worship. That is what he's after in the second commandment. So that's the reason for it. But then let's look at, therefore, why do we resist this command? I think it helps to actually talk a little bit about the reason as to why ancient cultures back then were so obsessed with worshiping graven images and idols, right? Particularly in ancient cultures, having a particular idol, a physical thing, meant, and it proved to them that that particular God was with them, right? Which is really understandable, right? Because how do you actually know if an invisible deity is with you? But more importantly, how do you know if that deity is pleased with you? Not just with you, but will give you the things that God is particularly offering. And so having an idol meant you had their presence. And if you had their presence, it meant that you could have their blessing. And so therefore, the way that commentators talk about the power of gods were collected and sort of channeled through these graven images, these things that they would make. And so long as people handled those images with care and that they performed the right kind of rituals, people could sort of guarantee the outcomes, the blessings that would come through, the power that would come through from those gods through these graven images to give you what you want. Now, the moment I say that, that is a very compelling idea. Who among us would not want that kind of a power or control over a God? That's what makes images very, very compelling, because it sort of gives you this sense that you can harness the power of the gods, and it gives you this measure of control. And that is why we resist, right? That is why it is that we want to and be tempted to create these images of God in our own image and to bottle him up into something that we can manage and particularly understand. Because it does absolutely give us a sense of power and control over God. It gives you a measure of control. And that's the thing. One of the things that we hate most is losing control, right? Or giving up control or power. And especially when the world around us feels really unpredictable, we grasp for power and for control all the time as a way for us to feel secure. And so we will always be grasping for more and more power. And God is actually saying, you need to give up your sense that you can control me. See, the heart of the second commandment is to essentially let God be God without our desire to try to manipulate or control him or harness his power in any kind of a way, but allow God in his complete freedom and his complete power to do as he wishes. And that is a very dangerous way to live. That's a very unpredictable way to live, because the moment that you let God actually be God in your life, that could lead to a very unpredictable life for you, because he can now do anything and require anything of you because he's God. It's frightening just to say that. And that is why we're always tempted to make an image of him, because it's much safer for him to be managed and bottled up and boxed up in our little pockets, so that we can imagine him, so that we can have a sense of control over him. And when we do, we always inevitably start to manage our relationship with this God, trying to harness his power by making bargains or trying to negotiate with him for the outcomes that we want. And so how many of us deeper in our hearts sort of believe, well, God, if I follow these rules, if I live according to the way that you want me to live, of course you should bless me, right? Of course you should give me the kind of life that I most desire, right? That if I go to church, and if I give to the church, and if I join a community group, and if I start to serve, of course you're going to bless me, right? That's the way that we start to manage and negotiate our relationship with God, try to get what we want from Him. And here's the thing, it can be cloaked all up in spiritual language, because one of the ways that this shows up, particularly even if you've been a Christian for a long time, is that this can show up in our prayer lives all the time. You know, prayer can move from being, I want to spend time with God because I love Him, to how do I pray so that I can start to bend the will of God toward my will? How do I pray so that I can get what I want? Well, the whole point of prayer is not only to spend time with God, but for our wills to be bent toward His. And that's the thing that we got to remember about the law, right? And about the law in general, but about this particular commandment too, that it's always on the basis of love and how God is wanting us to be relating to Him. He's saying, I want you to worship the way that I have called you to worship me, because that's also how you love me. Just like I can't love my wife however I want. It doesn't work like that. But true love actually has to take into consideration how the other person desires to be loved, how the other person has revealed themselves in their desires to you. And true love says, I'm going to meet that. I'm going to go do that. I'm going to be that for you. But every time we want to be tempted to create an image of God in our own image, we are saying to Him, I would rather control you than love you. And that is what's at the heart of this commandment. It feels safer for us to live that way, to control Him, than to love Him. And so imagining how we want Him to be is an attempt to try to manage His power and to keep Him in a box. And that is the very thing that God is saying, you mustn't do that. I forbid you to do that. And here's the deeper issues to why. And you can sort of get a sense of it already, right? That is essentially us playing God. It's a reversal of roles that we're meant to have with Him. And that, my friends, is the essence of what the Bible teaches as sin. What's wrong with this world, what's wrong with us, why we're separated from God. It is essentially that we are always trying to take God's place and put Him in ours. And so in the New Testament, one of the greatest expositions of what sin is comes from Romans chapter 1. The Apostle Paul talks about this. And he says this, that although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the created things rather than the Creator Himself. That is the essence of sin. It is an exchanging of the truth about God for a lie and having God serve us rather than the other way around. And He's saying anything in creation, that includes you and I, must not take the place of God. When we want to control Him, we are subjecting Him to our desires, and that is a complete reversal, making Him serve you rather than us serving Him. And it's an absurdity. It's an absurdity in that. Well, so how are we renewed? Because this leads us down a life that moves us further and further from God. And here's the crux of the problem. That when we make God in our own image, we inevitably have all of these distortions about Him. Right? So it's not just about false worship, but it's also the reason why we remain unable to trust Him completely. Right? Because a God that you can ultimately control and have power over is no God at all. No wonder you and I are too afraid to put our complete trust in this God. We've put Him in a box and made Him not God at all, who can't be trusted. You see the problem here? Which is why underneath all of our problems is always having a false image, a distortion of who God is. That's the root of all of our problems. That's the root of why we get anxious or stressed or angry or sin in any other kind of a way. Because why is it that we want something out of place? We don't trust that God is going to provide for us. We don't think that He's a provider, or that He's going to be good toward us, or He's going to truly love us when it matters most, or that He cares more about us than we could possibly care about ourselves. See, at the heart of that is always some kind of distortion about who God is. We have a false image of who He is, and we can't trust Him, and we can't love Him. So therefore, what do we do? How is it that we can be renewed? Well, friends, it is only if we can see that we are not to make God in our image, but we are meant to be made in his image. See, Romans 1 is telling us that we have taken God's rightful place in our lives. But what we're meant to be, our true place, is meant to actually be shaped by him the other way around. Remember in the book of Genesis, we learned that we are actually made in the image of God. That is to say, we're not meant to make images of him. We're meant to be an image of him. And in that right relationship, as we do, he's meant to give life to us. Not us trying to give life to him. He's meant to lead us, not us lead him. He's meant to control, and we are supposed to serve him, not the other way around. And you might be thinking at this point, well, how do you do that? Because he's this invisible God. How is it that I'm supposed to be an image of a God that I can't see, that's not represented in any kind of a way? That's the reason why we sort of grasp at things, because we don't know how to fill our imaginations. Our imaginations are not renewed in a way that is truthfully representative of who God is. And so like slaves, we grasp and we image things that are more reflective of us than of God. So how? How can we be an image of God when we don't know what he's like? Well, friends, let me bring you to the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul says in Colossians 1, he says this: the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creations. And then the writer of Hebrews says, the Son, Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. The incredible claim that is being made here in the Bible and in the New Testament is this: God is saying, don't make images, because I've given you the perfect image. I've given you him already. Don't try to take his place. I've given you someone that fully represents me, so you don't have to guess as to what I am like or what I want from you. Your scared, insecure hearts don't have to grasp for images to try to control me, because I'm a God that's given you everything for you to truly worship me. But that can only happen in and through Jesus Christ, my Son, whom I sent to be the exact representation of me. And you see, friends, if the essence of sin is us taking the place of God and wanting to do things that only he is meant to do, trying to control him so that he serves us, do you know what the essence of salvation is? Do you know what the essence of the good news of the gospel is? Is God taking our place. That though we didn't deserve it, that we're constantly trying to be like God as if we are God, challenging him. In his grace, God comes to take our place, to die the death that we should have died, the penalty of us making images, trying to control him for ourselves. And that's the only way that we can be healed of our false worship, is when we see Jesus Christ on the cross, who not only becomes visible to us, but he becomes visibly distraught, experiencing the worst pain that this world could possibly throw at him, the entire wrath of God for our sin. And he stays on that cross because he's completely obedient and faithful in listening to what God desires of him. He completely trusts and never wavers in his trust. To die the death that we should have died, and to give us the life that only he can give to us. Because that's the only way that we can be healed of our insecure hearts that can't fully trust him. And you see, friends, when you see what Jesus has done for you on the cross, you realize that only Jesus could fully represent this God. Where else does complete holiness and righteousness and wrath and judgment come together with love and grace? Love and sorrow flowed mingled down. There is no other picture or representation of God other than what Jesus is and what he's done for you and I on the cross. And when you see that, when you worship him for that, when you worship that God, that becomes true worship. And what Jesus promises is that as we do, we're going to be made in his image. He's going to renew us in Him. But only if we stop trying to control Him, only if we stop trying to manage God. And we'll find that if we let God truly be God, you will well up with the best news that you could possibly hear in your hearts. That's exactly what we need.